We're looking at biblical stories where good and grief intersect. The grief of Judas Iscariot doesn't seem to apply. It doesn't seem that we can connect grief with good. The life and death of Judas Iscariot are both puzzling and, when you look at it, disconcerting. Consider. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has spent the better part of 3 years with the disciples. We've all had spiritual guides, some better than others. They had Jesus Christ. Judas had Jesus Christ. The fact that Judas could resist Jesus' influence is startling and somewhat unnerving. What made Judas God-proof? Is it contagious? Let's investigate the scenes of his life in order to better understand how such a thing could come to be. Judas' defects of character are clearly expressed in the Bible. It says, Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. Learned a couple things that certainly would fall in the line of defects of character. He was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself when he had needs. He was a thief, and he was a hypocrite. He said what he was concerned about was that it should have been given to the poor, and that's really not what it's about. Money, biblically, is extremely seductive. It is godlike, and it is that which Jesus expresses as a rival God. And when you think about what God is like, God promises to provide and to reflect, to protect. He says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. And that's what God says, but that's also what money says. That's why in Hebrews 13:5, it says, let your lives be free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Because God says, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. The reason why the love of money is found there is because money says the same thing. Money says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. God says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. They're rival gods. They make rival promises. Judas had a problem with money worship, we find. It was money that tipped the scales that led Judas to betray Jesus. Shortly after the incident with the perfume, Judas went to the chief priests, and here's what it says. Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and asked, what are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you? I was looking for money. So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. It would not be a simple thing to hand Jesus over because he was very popular, and they needed to create a scene where they could do this where there's not a bunch of people around, where they could take him and incarcerate him before the crowd has a chance to protest. Judas arranged a time when Jesus would be isolated, and it was after the meal in the upper room. They were on their way to the Garden of Gethsemane, and when the dust settled, Jesus would already be in custody and the people would not rebel as much. So it says, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now, the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. Judas must have underestimated the danger that he would place Jesus in. He must not have understood how violent and how quick the punishment would be. He wasn't expecting this, I don't think. Look what it says. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What's that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Judas struggled with his betrayal. He wanted to be devoted to Jesus at some level. He spent 3 years with him. He would have been sent out 2 by 2, would have been Jesus' representative. It's possible, likely, that maybe he even had done some miracles. However, even though there were things in Judas that aligned him with Jesus, there were pockets of resistance as well. His belief sat alongside his disbelief. Why? Again, I think we would agree that that's not just a Judas thing for belief to stand alongside disbelief. We all have our pockets of belief and pockets of disbelief. Judas wasn't any different. Why then did this happen? A guy who spends this much time with Jesus and he ends up not being changed in his heart. How could that come to be? It seems to have something to do with God's purposes. Look what it says. Nevertheless, this is from Isaiah, and Isaiah writes at a time when the northern kingdom of Israel, called the House of Israel, it's where the Galileans lived. The northern part of Israel, where the Galileans were, Isaiah is predicting to the south, they are going to go into captivity and it's going to be really ugly. That's what Isaiah's task was, to warn the south there's things that are going to happen to the north and it's going to be terrible. And those things did occur. And Isaiah warns them as well that the south will have their turn as well. But look what it says. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the future, he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea, along the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. What Isaiah says is that at some point God will send an emissary, a Messiah. And the Messiah will shine the light of God's character in glory in a way that had not been shown before. And when he says the ones on whom this light would shine will not be the Judeans to the south. They were the faithful ones, the devoted ones. When God picks someone to be Jesus' emissaries, he's not going to take the Judeans, Isaiah predicts. He's going to take the Galileans, the ones to the north. And again, we got to understand, these people felt persona non grata as far as being meaningful or devoted to God was concerned. There's a prophet had a couple of kids, and God said, name the kids with respect to his relationship with the Galileans to the north. Lo Ami. Name your kid Lo Ami, said to the prophet. That means not mine. Not mine. You're not mine. Name the other kid Lo Ruhama. No mercy. That's the way they felt. They felt they were out of reach of God's mercy, out of reach of God's care, beyond salvage. And what Isaiah says, when Jesus looks for an emissary to represent him, he's not going to pick the Judeans immediately, he's going to pick the Galileans. That's what it indicates. He says, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea. I'm going to show you a map. We've seen this before, where the disciples come from. There's 12 of them. Anything strike you? An exception? All the disciples were from Galilee except one. One had a spiritual pedigree among those who were the devout, the earnest, the obedient, and it was Judas Iscariot. When Jesus knew who of the 12 would betray him, it might not necessarily have been him looking at Judas' heart, his thievery, his hypocrisy. It may well have been because he was a Judean, and he knew that when God picked an emissary, it wouldn't be the arrogant people to the south. It will be the humbled people to the north, because that's what Jesus came to do. Jesus came to indicate that salvation is not a paycheck. You don't submit the things that you've done for him. Here's how much I've tithed. Here's how much I've read the Bible. Here's what I've yada. And that's what it can be easy to think that way, that we hand in our worksheets and God gives us a paycheck, salvation. But it's not a paycheck, it's a gift. It's something he bestows on those who don't have a basis upon which to claim it. That's what we find. The northern and southern parts of Israel went into captivity. And part of their captivities were very different. We've done this before. Let's say you guys here, make you guys the Galileans. Yeah, you're the Galileans, you're the Judeans. Okay, you're in the Galileans in the north part. You're the persona non grata. Put your head down. I'm just kidding. And you're the Judeans. What ends up happening, the captivity that you experienced was horrific. The Assyrians were brutal, and their objective was to so suppress you that you would never dream of rebelling. And that's what they did. They were horrible. And that's what the northerners experienced. Their religion had been eradicated. And that's why they call it Galilee of the Gentiles, because they had been intermarried and they lost the distinctiveness of their culture. So you guys you live in the northern part, but you kind of are half-breed Jews. You guys in the south, it's a different thing. You went into a different captivity, the Babylonians. And that's where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the way they did things, they said, no, we don't want to eradicate culture. We want to educate it. So what they did, they had the best and the brightest go to Babylon and then enculturate. So they allowed the Judeans in the north to retain their religious culture. And this is what it created, is two very different cultures. So for you over here, you still really care about about what the Pharisees said. In fact, I said this before. There were all kinds of Pharisees in the South, and they had all kinds of questions about what you can do on the Sabbath. Because when they went through the captivity, it was still really difficult. But here's how the South reacted. Tell you what, we are not going to even get close to disobeying the law anymore. In fact, what they did, they put fence laws around the law. No, not only are we not going to take holy the Lord's Day, we are not even going to get close to doing that. So what they did, there's no work on the Lord's Day, right? So what they did, they said, well, what constitutes work? If you put on a tie and walk down from the second floor to the first, that's not work because you're wearing the tie. If you are carrying the tie, is that work? That's work. And so that's the kind of thing. In the South, they were always asking the Pharisees, hey, is this okay to do on the Sabbath? Is that okay? And Pharisees were always getting questions. Okay, there was a Pharisee that lived in the northern part of Israel. Lived there for 18 years. 2 questions about what to do on the Sabbath. It wasn't in them to care as much. They weren't as devoted. They saw themselves as kind of beyond salvage. That's what these 2 things were like. The bonds of faith and family were very strong in the South, not as strong in the North. And Judas wasn't able to break free. It really mattered to him what the Pharisees thought. He couldn't break free of it. He couldn't, because he couldn't make from his culture so that he could go to Jesus. And he ended his life in a field of blood. And here's the thing. As we think about Judas ending his life and the place where he's called is called the field of blood. And here's what ends up happening to that place. There we go. Here we go. Thanks, Jonathan. The chief priest said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place. And this is what you're going to find. Where there's judgment, God is doing something to include people in some way who prior to that time were not included. The field of blood, what that became, is a burial place for Gentiles, a burial place for foreigners. To a Jew, there were 2 kinds of people. There were Jews and there were everyone else. Everyone else is a Gentile. And Gentiles really didn't have any place in God's family. Here's the way Paul writes. He says, those who were Gentiles were strangers, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, without hope and without God in the world. And so that's kind of what it was like to be a Gentile. And this place, the field of blood, became a place where Gentiles could get buried. Paul is the one who saw this most clearly. And so what we're going to see, I've said this before as well, we tend to view things as black and white, like checkers. You move a piece to a white spot or a black spot, and it's pretty straightforward. Pretty easy game to learn. Chess, anybody play chess? Chess is a different thing. Not black and white. You got to think moves ahead. And with respect to his purposes, God plays chess, not checkers. Look what it says. It talks about how God responded to, well, look what it says. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Do you remember? So I think we made Galileans or Judeans. Do you remember? Judeans. You guys are good guys. You guys are the Judeans. You guys are the Galileans. You guys are the buttheads. Okay. Israel has experienced a captivity a blinding in heart until now. So that either means one of two things. It means all of you who are Jews have been partially blinded, or some of you have been completely blinded. And what ended up happening? That's what ended up happening to you guys. When Jesus came, it made no sense to you that you would believe him. You guys here, you had some room for him. And that's why the disciples came from where you guys are. You guys had no room for him. And you know the reason why? It's because you're bad people. No, you were blinded. Who blinded you? Who blinded you? He did. God did. You weren't supposed to see. And here's what ended up happening. And it talks about it here. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles come in. So here's what it looked like. So you guys ended up believing. You guys didn't. You were blinded. You guys were in control. You were in charge. You were the leaders. And you know what you did? You made it a crime to believe in Jesus. And you know what you did with them? You drop-kicked them out of the kingdom. Stoned them, berated them, mistreated them. And you know where they ended up going? The Roman Empire. And what did they do in the Roman Empire? They spread the news that we experience today. See, God's playing chess. So there's opposition, but in the opposition, he's accomplishing his purposes. And it goes on. And so all Israel will be saved. At some point, your blindness will be removed. Jewish blindness will be removed. They will mourn the one that they're pierced. And you know what you're going to understand? At some point, all of you who are, if you're Jews, what you're going to understand, and it's going to be so powerful. You know, God's going to say to you, I never disowned you. There was a difficult thing. I needed to do something so that the Gentiles could hear, but I never disowned you. There's a theology in the church, in the Gentile church, that every promise made to Jews has now been taken from them and given to the Gentile church. That is wrong. God doesn't choose somebody and wipe his hands. Aren't you glad about that? Aren't you? That God doesn't choose and then wash his hands of people? What kind of security we would have if we worshiped a God like that? But we don't. We have a God whose salvation is a gift, not a paycheck, and who doesn't rescind it once he gives it. You know what we have to do? Believe it. And that's what we do. We look at Judas. Now, there's some things we don't understand, but what we see in back of Judas, there's a God who is accomplishing purposes. Look at the way Paul described it. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and so this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As far as the gospel is concerned, you know what he's saying? As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account. Judeans are enemies on account of Galileans. You guys are going to be waved in, and then you're going to be able to go to let Gentiles come in. But then look what's going to happen at some point. It says, as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account, but as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs because God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. What that means, irrevocable, means not to be repented of. God never gives somebody a gift and says, I wish I hadn't given that to them. He never changes his mind. He never said, I zigged when I should have zagged. And when God extends the gift of eternal life, you can't do anything to cause him to bring it back. Not possible. It's a gift, not a paycheck. What ends up happening, if we believe that, we understand that even when we go through difficult things, he will never leave you and never forsake you. That's the lesson that I want us to bring from this. It says God's gifts and his purpose and his call are irrevocable. It wasn't his will for most Jews to embrace Christ as Messiah. That wasn't his purpose. At some point, I've said this before, God's waving Gentiles in, saying stop to Jews, waving Gentiles in. At some point, this will happen. When the fullness of the Gentiles, I don't know what that means, I don't know how many, it will happen that there'll be a red light. And at that point, in the end, Jews will be waved in. What do we do with this? Here's where Paul lands. Just to close. God has bound all men over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all. The word disobedience is an important word. It's disobedience rooted in disbelief. Say you had a parent that you really, maybe I'll say it that way because we think God is Father. You have a parent you didn't trust. Parent you didn't trust. They said, go do this, and it'll work out fine. And let's say you didn't trust them, so you didn't do what they said. Why didn't you do what they said? See, there's different kinds of disobedience. There's a disobedience which is, I just don't care. I'm not going to do what you say. That's one type of disobedience. That's not the disobedience it talks about here. The disobedience it talks about is, I don't trust you, therefore I'm not going to do what you say. That's God kind of nets all people into disobedience so he can have mercy on them all. You say, Mike, in some ways I don't trust. I don't trust. And what this passage says, that's not a barrier, because God's salvation is never a paycheck. It's always a gift. It says, Paul sees this, and I think this comes clear to him, and here's what he ends up doing. I think if we look at him, Paul understood what God was doing with you, and everything came together, and here's his response. I think he was astonished that any divine being could be that good and that merciful and that wise. It absolutely is. I tell you what, on the far side, as his children, I'm gonna say something. We're gonna sit down and talk on the far side. We're gonna say, remember we talked about how God's mercies are going to show up at the end of the road. Did you ever imagine that it would mean this? We're going to say, no, I didn't. We serve a God who is incredibly merciful, and he uses all these different things to accomplish really good purposes. And we are going to spend eternity with him. And I think we'll see Judas there as well. Stand for closing prayer. Father, thank you that you don't wash your hands of people. You didn't wash your hands of Judas. Again, there's things we don't know, because things matter. And what we do know, at the end of the road, your mercy is going to be what's going to be highlighted, because that's what you're like. Thanks for that. In Jesus' name, amen.